I was opposed to Iraq from the get-go. First off, where was the military threat? Well, okay, I hear there are weapons of mass destruction, but you know what? We have the military surveillance capability to see them do that. If they do that, we can go in and address it. I thought if we went into Iraq, we would find ourselves in a civil war to which there would be no end. Afghanistan, initially, I thought was totally warranted. That's what our military is for. We were attacked, we attacked back. We are at war with Al-Qaeda, we are at war with terrorism, but after having been in Afghanistan for 6 months, we had effectively wiped out Al-Qaeda. That was 10 years ago. We're building roads, schools, bridges, highways, and hospitals in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're borrowing 43 cents out of every dollar to do this. Come on. And worst of all, men and servicewomen are losing their lives. Let's get out of Iraq and Afghanistan tomorrow. Libya, A through Z, I'm opposed to what we're doing in Libya. Where was the military threat? Where was the congressional authorization? Where in the Constitution does it say that because you don't like a foreign dictator, that we should go in and topple that foreign dictator? Are we not in a civil war in Libya? Don't 5 other countries in the Middle East right now qualify for that same intervention? Is there any end to this? Believing in free markets. I talked about free markets when it came to schools. Well, look, schools, what's the best thing that the federal government can do for education in this country? I know this is about Lean Six Sigma. So I know this is about Lean Six Sigma. So how would I apply Lean Six Sigma to the Federal Department of Education? I wouldn't need it at all because I would eliminate it. The federal government gives every state 11 cents out of every dollar that they spend for education, but that's 14 cents that goes to Washington, coming back as 11 cents, and it comes back with 16 cents worth of strings attached, so it's kind of a no-brainer. It costs more money to take federal money than what you get for federal money. Give education back to the states. 50 laboratories of innovation, 50 laboratories of best practice. We'd have best practices that would emerge. That would be a good thing. Free market approach to healthcare, something that, by the way, healthcare in this country is about as far removed from free market as it possibly could be. Lean Six Sigma approaches to healthcare are going to bear out the fact that 40% of healthcare costs are bureaucratic, that they don't need to exist. In a free market system for healthcare, I would buy myself health insurance to cover myself for catastrophic injury or illness, and I would pay as you go in a very competitive environment that the free market brings about for healthcare. Free market approaches to energy, looking at energy from a free market standpoint. Free market-driven energy, but it needs to be a balanced approach. Immigration right now. Immigration starts with welfare reform in this country. Are Mexicans coming across the border and taking entry-level jobs from Americans? Absolutely not, because you and I as Americans can sit at home and collect a welfare check that's just a little bit less money or the same amount of money for doing nothing. So we need to reform welfare. Immigration should be about work, not welfare, period, and you got to give that to the states to enforce that. But immigration is a good thing. We're a country based on immigrants. We're educating the best and brightest kids now from all across the planet, and we're sending them back to their countries of origin as opposed to them staying here in this country to start up their businesses and ultimately employ tens of millions of Americans as opposed to tens of millions of Indians, which is what is going to happen given our convoluted immigration policies. Let's make it as easy as possible for somebody that wants to come into this country and work to get a work visa. Not citizenship, not a green card, but a work visa entailing a background check and a Social Security card so that applicable taxes would get paid. We have 11 million illegal immigrants in this country right now. What's the main reason why they're here in this country right now? It's because the government's made it impossible to get a work permit, and so they've come across the border illegally. Let's set up a grace period whereby we can document these workers with a work visa. That's securing the borders. The notion of building a fence across 2,000 miles of border, the notion of putting the National Guard arm in arm across 2,000 miles of border, in my opinion, would be a whole lot of money spent with very little, if any, benefit whatsoever. And don't underestimate the drugs on the border as the cause for so much of what is happening. 28,000 deaths south of the border over the last 4 years. If we can't connect the dots between prohibition and violence today, I don't know if we ever will. These deaths are disputes that are being played out with guns rather than courts. If you haven't looked at the drug issue, I would implore you to look at the drug issue and see if you don't come to the same conclusion that I have, and that is that 90% of the drug problem is prohibition-related, not use-related, and that's not to discount the problems with use and abuse, but that ought to be the focus. Let's be committed to spending our money in ways that are cost-effective. Best product, best service, lowest price. Thank you so much for allowing me here to give you this resume. Thank you so much for all of what you do. Lean Six Sigma will be a part of my analysis as President of the United States to bring about these savings. Thank you.
Governor, I'd like to ask Mike George to come back. This is really a reenactment since you've done this before, but for the benefit of the audience and for posterity, I'll get out of the way.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, Mike.
I want to point out that the governor gave the pen back. Not all the candidates have done that.
Governor Johnson, you want to have a chair? Thank you, Mike. A couple of questions. You got a lot of serious people here from Defense Department backgrounds, General Peake, Undersecretary of the Army Kirby, a lot of people who've served, and you say 44% reduction.
43% reduction, yes.
What's that mean in terms of aircraft carriers? Are we going to half or 4 out of 10? Or what's it really mean? Where's that come from?
Well, it means getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and as governor of New Mexico, something that I relished as governor of New Mexico was this whole notion of getting immersed in the beans. I mean, what is the money getting spent on? I don't know of anyone in this country that thinks we should have 100,000 troops on the ground in Europe. In Japan, we have 30,000 troops on the ground, and the Prime Minister of Japan, the last election, ran on getting the United States out of Japan, and that was from a friendly standpoint. We don't need the help anymore from the United States, and he ran on that notion, and yet we're still there, and he resigned as Prime Minister of Japan.
But in terms of the specifics of the 44% cut, you can't get there from just getting rid of the Iraq, even if people agreed with that. What, would you reduce the armed services by 44%? Would you reduce the number of wings on the Air Force by 44%?
Well, getting back to Lean Six Sigma and getting back to the notion of analyzing all of this, which is something that I relish. I relish the job as governor. I thought it was blood-boiling to actually immerse myself in bringing about a solution to statements that I had made. And in this case, I'm committed to that number. I will say I'm completely opposed to foreign aid. The notion that we're borrowing 43 cents out of every dollar and then we're giving it away to foreign countries, a calculation that I did on the back of my napkin. The interest that we're paying China right now on the amount of money that they've loaned us pays for their defense spending for a year. If that doesn't get to you.
So, Governor, I'm not getting it, so I'll try one more time. 43%, where did the number come from and how do you think you get there?
Well, so when you talk about aircraft carriers, it's my understanding that when it comes to aircraft carriers, that it's kind of an outmolded technology, that we can fly anywhere in the world right now to accomplish our missions, and that would be from the United States. That submarines really are the future, that submarines are really the deterrent. So why do we have, and I just pose this question rhetorically, I think that this whole thing needs to come under the microscope. I think it's important to have military alliances with other countries from the standpoint of other countries sharing in the cost of military defense as opposed to us picking up the tab. All these vaunted all these vaunted infrastructure projects, transportation projects in Europe, healthcare in Europe. We've underwritten that because they haven't had to pick up the tab when it comes to defense. So opposed to foreign aid, but military alliance is very key to this notion of being able to eliminate or reduce our spending by that amount of money. We're spending more money on defense than all the other countries in the world combined, and we're 5% of the world's population.
So I understand, but you would mothball the carriers?
I would not be so naive, or I'm not going to misspeak here by saying that's what I would do. What I am saying, and I hope you would see it based on my resume, is that I would be committed to this 43% reduction because, look, I watched on the screen there from the beginning. Politicians talk about balancing the budget in 20 or 30 years. That's not balancing the budget. I'm going to submit a balanced budget for the year 2013. The reality is that it might actually get done after a certain amount of time, but that's the president you would elect with me. And if you're going to elect a president that's going to balance the budget in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years because that's the realistic thing to do, then we're not going to address this at all.
And last question. You are well known for your advocacy of revisiting drug policy, and you mentioned it in your remarks. But Lean Six Sigma says always start with what the customer wants. The American people seem to want to keep illegal drugs prohibited.
Actually, I would disagree with that completely, that right now 46% of Americans support legalizing marijuana. The issue is actually a couple of years away from a tipping point, and from my experience, this is an issue that does really well when people talk about it. So if you don't agree with this issue, talk about it. If you think that this should happen, talk about it. With lights shined on this issue, this is an issue that moves forward, it doesn't move back.
I'll give you 46% on marijuana, but on cocaine, on crystal methamphetamine, and the other drugs, are you also advocating revisiting those regimes?
The only drug that I'm advocating legalizing is marijuana. When it comes to all the other drugs, I advocate harm reduction strategies, the things that we really care about, which is reducing death, disease, crime, corruption. In a nutshell, it's looking at the drug problem first as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. Let's recognize right now that half of what we spend on law enforcement, the courts, and the prisons is drug-related. We're arresting 1.8 million people a year in this country. We now have 2.3 million people behind bars in this country. The majority of them are there because of drug-related crime. China has 4 times the population and 1.5 million people behind bars. This is America. Freedom, liberty, the personal responsibility that goes along with that. This is not a communist authoritarian dictatorship, and yet if you were to look at the numbers without the labels, you would think we're China.
Governor Gary Johnson, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.